at the source of the Nile. Warm air shimmered over the Nile in the soft light of the setting sun. Palm trees rustled gently, their reflections dancing on the water's surface, and the breeze carried with it ancient songs. The same ones whispered here, long before the first kings walked the earth. In the heart of the valley, where golden sand met fertile soil, a story began. In a modest home near a sacred temple, a girl was born and named Nefertari, meaning the one for whom the sun rises. From a young age, she was unlike the other children. Her eyes were as deep as the midnight Nile, and her voice carried the calm of the evening wind brushing against water. She listened, not just to people, but to birds, leaves, and even silence. Often she could be found standing barefoot by the river, her hands immersed in its waters, as though in silent conversation with the great current. Her father, a respected temple priest, understood the stars and read the messages of the wind. He did not raise his daughter with strict rules, but instead showed her the beauty hidden in the ordinary. He taught her to see the essence of things. He knew she would not live an ordinary life. Nefertari's mother passed away when the girl was only 6 years old. Her absence wrapped the home in silence. Yet Nefertari did not cry. She simply became even more observant, more attuned to the world around her. Over time, her quiet strength began to reveal itself. She helped her father at the temple, collected herbs, and quietly observed the sacred rituals. No one taught her prayers. They seemed to live within her already. By the time she turned 15, a royal procession arrived in her city. At its head was a young pharaoh, newly crowned. He was just over 20 years old, surrounded by guards, advisors, and nobles. His name was already being spoken with awe and reverence across the land. He was considered the son of the sun, ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. The procession came to the temple where her father served. The priests prepared incense and oils, filling the air with sweet smoke. Nefertari stood off to the side, wearing a simple white dress, her hair neatly braided. Around her neck was a turquoise necklace, the last thing she had from her mother. She did not know it yet, but this day would mark the beginning of a path that would lead her toward immortality. Among the ceremonies and offerings, the pharaoh noticed her. She did not speak, but he studied her in silence. In her, he saw more than beauty. He saw peace. A few days later, envoys from the palace arrived at her home. They brought gifts of incense, linen, golden bracelets, and a message. The girl was summoned to the royal court. Her father was not surprised. He had known such a moment would come. Without words, he blessed her and gave her an amulet bearing the symbol of Isis, the goddess of divine femininity and sacred wisdom. At the palace, she was welcomed not as a guest, but as someone destined for something greater. She was given a room that overlooked a garden filled with acacia and myrrh. Servants dressed her, brushed her hair, and taught her court etiquette. But in her eyes, there was no fear, only quiet dignity. It felt as if she was remembering something, not learning it for the first time. In the evenings, she would stand on the terrace, gazing at the river. Her thoughts flowed like the Nile, deep and steady. She could sense that her life was changing, that a new chapter had begun, one filled with challenges and revelations. The palace was a world of its own. Smiles often hid envy. Gold weighed heavily on shoulders. There were many words, but little truth. Yet Nefertari listened, not to what was said, but to what was left unspoken. A few weeks later, preparations began for a sacred ceremony. The priests of Hathor and Thoth agreed. This girl would be introduced to the people as the future great royal wife. The decision came quickly, but first she would have to undergo a ritual cleansing, a passage from one life into another. On the night before the ceremony, Nefertari could not sleep. She sat by the window, holding the amulet her mother had once worn. Silence wrapped around her like a shawl. Far off, a jackal sang. The wind carried the scent of frankincense. She felt no fear, only a deep awareness that her life no longer belonged solely to herself. As the first rays of the sun slid across the palace walls, Nefertari rose and walked down the corridor. The walls were covered in paintings of gods and legends. Her body felt light and her mind clear. Thus began her journey, a path that would lead to immortality, secrets, love, and eternity. The Pharaoh's eyes. The sun climbed slowly over the desert, casting golden light across the courtyards of the royal palace. Stone columns glowed with warmth, their hieroglyphs whispering secrets from 1,000 years ago. In the gardens, white lotuses floated in shallow pools, and birds called softly from the sycamores. The palace was alive, but serene, and within its quiet heart walked Nefertari, now no longer just a girl from the temple. Since her arrival, the palace had become both a sanctuary and a maze. Everything was grand, beautiful, and precise. The way servants moved, the rhythm of the bells, the scent of flowers changing with each hour. It was a world designed for the gods. And Nefertari, though still only 15, was now a part of it. She moved through this world with grace, never rushing, never hesitating. Every morning she woke before sunrise and stood in silence, greeting the new day as her father had taught her. Then she would sit in the garden, surrounded by olive trees and jasmine, her thoughts drifting like the breeze. The young pharaoh, Ramses, watched her often. He was not like others, not to her. Though powerful and revered, there was a quietness in him, a searching. He seemed drawn to the way she listened more than she spoke. He admired how she observed everything. The way water curled in a clay bowl, how a falcon's shadow passed over the sand. They rarely spoke in those early days, but words were not needed. In the stillness between them, something grew, a connection like a slow-moving river, calm, certain, and deep. As the days passed, the court whispered, "Who was this girl who captured the attention of the son of Ra?" Some called her too quiet, others said she was enchanted. But no one could deny that in her presence, the palace seemed to breathe a little softer. One evening, a celebration was held in honor of the floodwaters returning to the Nile. Musicians played gentle melodies, and oil lamps flickered in the dusk. Nefertari stood beneath a canopy of linen and stars, her white dress catching the breeze. Ramses approached her then, not as a king, but as a man moved by wonder. From that night forward, they spent more time together, not in grand halls, but in hidden courtyards and near sacred pools. Nefertari told him stories her mother once whispered by lamplight. She spoke of the sky's voice in the desert, of how papyrus remembers every hand that touches it. Ramses, in return, shared his visions for Egypt, a land of peace, of temples that touched the sun. In private, he revealed the weight of the crown, not the gold, but the responsibility. And Nefertari listened, never interrupting, but offering presence. the kind that made burdens feel lighter. One day she was taken to the temple of Mut, where priestesses examined the stars and cast oils upon fire. They said she was born under a rare celestial pattern, a balance of order and magic. Her path, they said, was blessed by Isis herself. When Ramses heard this, he did not hesitate. He knew then that Nefertari was not only the woman he admired, but the one fated to walk beside him. She would not only share his throne, she would shape his reign. Preparations for the royal union began. Fine linen was woven, gold was molded into sacred forms. The court buzzed with activity. But Nefertari remained still, calm, rooted like a sycamore before a storm. She walked again to the riverbank where she had once stood as a girl. The same waters flowed past her feet, but the woman who stood there now had crossed into another life. Above her, the stars began to emerge. She whispered thanks to the winds, to the gods, and to her mother's memory. And the Nile answered, not in words, but in rhythm. The queen's coronation. Morning came softly, wrapped in gold and quiet winds. The sun rose not with haste, but with reverence, as if the heavens themselves were watching. In the inner sanctum of the palace, Nefertari awoke to the gentle rustle of linen curtains and the scent of blue lotus drifting through the air. This day was unlike any other. It was the day she would be crowned as great royal wife. The palace was in motion. Attendants walked with careful purpose, their arms full of ceremonial robes, jewels, and oils. Priests murmured prayers over bowls of incense, and priestesses swept sacred chalk across stone floors. But in Nefertari's chamber, time seemed to slow. She sat calmly before a polished bronze mirror, her reflection steady, her breath measured like the rhythm of the Nile. Her robe was white, woven from fine linen, so light it moved with every breath. Around her neck, a broad collar gleamed. Lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian, stones said to hold protection, power, and peace. Her wrists bore golden cuffs, etched with the eye of Horus, while her hair was braided with thin threads of silver. When the time came, she stepped barefoot onto the cool stone floor. Two handmaidens guided her through the palace corridors, past tall columns painted in the colors of sunrise. As she walked, soft music rose in the distance, harps, flutes, and a drum that pulsed like a heartbeat. The coronation took place in the Temple of Amun, a sacred space reserved only for the most solemn rites. Its vast halls were carved with the stories of kings and gods, and the ceiling shimmered with stars painted in deep cobalt. At the center, beneath a shaft of sunlight, stood the Pharaoh. Ramses was adorned in royal gold and deep red, symbols of eternity and divine rule. His headdress bore the uraeus, the cobra of kingship, and his staff was carved from cedar, smooth and ancient. But his eyes, they were fixed only on her. Nefertari approached in silence. With each step, flower petals fell at her feet, laid by the priestesses of Hathor. As she reached the platform, the high priest began the ancient invocation, words spoken only at coronations, passed down for generations. The air grew still. A golden diadem was lifted and placed gently on her head. A hush fell over the temple, as if even the gods paused to listen. She was no longer simply Nefertari. She was now the great royal wife, beloved of the gods, the living vessel of divine balance beside the ruler of Egypt. Outside, crowds had gathered beyond the temple walls. When the announcement rang through the palace gates, a cheer rose that echoed down the Nile. People threw garlands of flowers into the river. Children danced in the dust. The nation welcomed their queen. That night, the stars burned brighter. A grand feast filled the palace with laughter and scent, roasted figs, honeyed dates, fresh bread and wine. Dancers moved like water. Musicians played songs older than the pyramids. But Nefertari slipped away. She wandered through the moonlit gardens alone, the music fading behind her. She found a quiet bench beneath a sycamore tree, the same kind of tree her mother used to rest under when telling bedtime stories. The breeze played with her veil. Her fingers traced the amulet at her neck. In her silence, she felt the weight of her new name, not as a burden, but as a calling. She was now a bridge between earth and sky, between the people and the gods. Her voice would carry through council halls. Her presence would calm storms. Her wisdom would guide generations to come. And yet she was still the girl from the river, the one who listened to the water, the one who knew the difference between silence and peace. The stars above glowed like embers. She closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer, not for power, but for clarity, not for fame, but for harmony. And when she opened them again, she saw the Nile glowing beneath the moon, endless, ancient, and full of stories yet to be told. Whispers of the temple. Night in Thebes was not silent, it breathed. The wind sighed through columns and swayed the papyrus reeds along the river bank. From deep within the temple courtyards came the low hum of prayers, murmured not with urgency, but with reverence. Lanterns glowed like stars across the marble walkways, and incense trailed in threads of gold. Nefertari, now queen and great royal wife, moved gently through the sacred halls of the Temple of Isis. This temple was not open to all, and even the high-ranking officials entered it with bowed heads. It was a place of mysteries, a chamber between the worlds. Here, among lotus pools and shadowed sanctuaries, she came not as royalty, but as a seeker. The temple guardians knew her by name. She had visited before her coronation as a child. But now, she was different. Her steps were measured, her gaze steady, her silence rich with knowing. The priestesses welcomed her in silence, leading her to the inner chamber, where only a handful were permitted to enter. Inside, the air was cool and still. Stone walls were carved with delicate scenes, Isis spreading her wings, Osiris rising from the underworld, the sunbark gliding through the night sky. A circular pool sat in the center of the chamber, its water still and black, reflecting only the ceiling above, painted with constellations. The high priestess offered Nefertari a place beside the pool. No words were spoken. In this temple, truth was not taught through language, but through presence. Time seemed to stretch, unraveling into something ancient and soft. Hours passed unnoticed. When Nefertari opened her eyes, the chamber was dark. A single flame burned at the altar. The priestess handed her a scroll, old, fragile, bound in red thread. The script was faint, but alive. The scroll spoke not of power, but of balance. It told of a queen from long ago, one who guided not with command, but with calm. She listened to the stars, to dreams, to the Nile, and in doing so, she held a kingdom in harmony. That night, Nefertari returned to her chambers with the scroll. She did not read it all at once. Instead, She unrolled a few lines each night, letting the meaning sink into her slowly, like water into sand. The scroll spoke of signs, patterns in the stars, shifts in the river's rhythm, animals appearing at unusual hours. These were not coincidences, but messages. A queen's duty was not only to rule, but to sense. The next morning, she rose before the sun. She walked barefoot through the gardens, listening. A falcon flew low, circling once, then vanishing into the dawn. At breakfast, a servant spilled water in the shape of a spiral, and in the courtyard, a stone had cracked overnight. Inside, a tiny scarab rested, perfectly still. She wrote these things down, not because she understood them fully, but because she felt they meant something. Over time, the signs repeated: spirals, falcons, scarabs, always near water, always when the wind shifted. One afternoon, she returned to the temple, seeking guidance. The high priestess invited her to sit beside the mirror pool again. They waited in silence. As the sun moved across the sky, its light passed through a small window and struck the surface of the pool. For a moment, the water shimmered, not with the reflection of the ceiling, but with the image of a crown surrounded by flame. Then it was gone. The priestess spoke softly. The first words Nefertari had heard in that place in many weeks. What is born in fire must be tempered by water. What rises to power must learn to yield. That evening, Nefertari sat beneath a fig tree and thought about balance, the dance between strength and surrender, between rule and rest. She remembered her father's voice, her mother's stories, the feel of the Nile against her feet. She understood now. Being queen was not about control. It was about alignment, about listening for what others ignored, feeling for what could not be seen. The temple had given her more than symbols. It had reminded her who she was. Not just a figure beside the throne, but a quiet force moving beneath it. Like the river, like the stars. And in that stillness, as the moon climbed and the wind sang through the palms, she knew her role was only beginning. Secrets beneath the sand. The heat of the day had softened. Dusk lay gently over Thebes, turning the sky a shade between rose and gold. Shadows stretched across the courtyards like silent guardians, and the city seemed to pause in a breathless hush. In the stillness, Nefertari stood at the edge of the desert. She had come alone, leaving behind the music of the palace and the murmurs of the court. Before her stretched endless dunes, soft and rippling, glowing under the fading sun. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay secrets too old for memory, too deep for words. That morning, a message had arrived. A clay tablet sealed in wax and marked with the symbol of the House of Life. It came from a temple far south, near the Valley of the Kings. Its lines spoke of something unearthed, not gold, not jewels, but writing, symbols carved into walls long buried by sand. The priests who found them did not understand their meaning. They were older than hieroglyphs, older than the known gods. Nefertari had always felt drawn to the hidden, not out of curiosity, but recognition, as if the unknown whispered her name. Now she found herself walking through the cool entrance of a half-buried temple. The air inside smelled of earth and time. Stone steps led downward, each one worn by footsteps thousands of years gone. Torches flickered along the walls. As she descended, ancient figures emerged, tall, strange beings with eyes shaped like moons, arms lifted to stars. She didn't know their names, but they felt familiar, like fragments of a dream. At the lowest chamber, a white tablet lay across a stone altar. Unlike anything she had seen before, its surface was covered in symbols that shimmered slightly, as if inked in starlight. She reached out, fingertips barely grazing the surface. A pulse, subtle, like the first ripple in still water, passed through her hand. A vision unfolded. She saw a great flood, not of water, but of fire. Temples burning, cities vanishing beneath waves of sand, and above it all, a woman in white, standing still as the storm passed around her. In her hand, the same scroll Nefertari had been reading. On her head, a crown shaped like a crescent moon. The vision faded, but the feeling remained. This place, these symbols, this message, they were for her. She returned to the palace in silence. The stars above Thebes were bright, sharp like crystal. She held the vision close, not sharing it with the court, not yet. She needed time. She needed to listen. That night, Nefertari sat beside the reflecting pool. The wind moved across the surface, drawing tiny ripples. Somewhere, deep beneath the surface of sand and stone, something had awakened, and she was ready to follow. The moon of Abu Simbel. Far to the south, beyond the reach of Thebes and the murmurs of the court, stood the great sandstone cliffs of Abu Simbel. Here the temple carved into the mountain looked out across the Nile like a sleeping guardian. Its colossal statues of Ramses sat in silence, watching the river pass through time. It was a place of power and of quiet warning. Nefertari had traveled here under the veil of night, not as queen, but as a pilgrim. She wore no crown, no gold, only linen, a veil, and the amulet from her mother, now warm with age and memory. The vision from the desert temple still pulsed in her thoughts, and she had come seeking answers beneath the stone gaze of the gods. Inside the inner chambers of Abu Simbel, the air was thick with stillness. Each step echoed, as if the walls remembered every visitor across centuries. Paintings glowed faintly under torchlight, gods with animal faces, kings offering gifts, and stars flowing like water across the ceiling. Here, the divine and the earthly touched. At the far end of the hall stood 4 statues, Ra-Horakhti, Ptah, Amun, and Ramses himself, carved as a god. But Nefertari's eyes turned to the shadowed side wall. There, barely visible, was a smaller figure, a woman draped in white, crescent crown above her brow. She held a staff wrapped in flame, and behind her, stars fell from the sky. The priest who accompanied her whispered that this image had no name, no inscription. Some said it was a forgotten goddess. Others believed it was a prophecy, too dangerous to preserve in words. Nefertari stood in silence, eyes on the flame-tipped staff. She felt the memory of the desert tablet, of the fire and water, of the ancient scrolls. Patterns began to form, not with logic, but with instinct. She did not need to understand everything. She only needed to trust what she felt. Outside, the moon rose, low, full and orange as fire. Its light touched the cliffs and the temple's face. It was said that twice a year, the sun entered Abu Simbel and lit the inner statues. But tonight, it was the moon that spoke. As she stepped from the temple, Wind caught her veil. The river below shimmered, the stars above shifted. She heard no voice, yet she knew the time of prophecy was drawing near. Something old was waking, and it would test the balance she had sworn to protect. Nefertari did not turn back. She walked calmly to the boat, waiting on the riverbank. Her reflection on the water looked different now. Not younger, not older, just awakened. The stranger from the sands. The palace in Thebes shimmered beneath the heat of the midday sun, its white walls glowing against the blue sky. Fountains trickled in the courtyards, and perfumed air drifted through open columns. From a distance, it appeared peaceful, eternal, like the river that passed alongside it. But within its walls, the air had changed. Servants moved more quietly. Guards stood longer at their posts. Whispers flowed through the halls like desert wind. Since Nefertari's return from Abu Simbel, a stillness had taken root. She spoke little of her journey, yet those close to her felt the shift. She was calm, but with the silence of a gathering storm. That calm was broken the day the stranger arrived. He came not on foot, but by camel, bearing a cloak of foreign design and a scroll sealed with wax that bore no emblem known to the palace scribes. His skin was sun-darkened, and his eyes carried the pale hue of distant mountains. He claimed no title, only a message, and that it was for the queen alone. Ramses, ever cautious, allowed the meeting under strict guard, but Nefertari requested privacy. They met in the shade of the royal garden, where papyrus plants rustled softly, and the sound of birds filled the air. The stranger knelt and placed the scroll before her. His voice was low and steady, his language accented but clear. He had traveled from the far edge of the desert, beyond the oases, past the lands of Nubia, from a place not found on maps. He spoke of a tribe that watched the stars, not for worship, but for warning. They had seen a pattern forming, the same one etched on the walls of the temple in Abu Simbel and carved into stone deep beneath the sands. It foretold a shift, a crossing of paths that happened once in many lifetimes, and it named a woman a queen, born under a crescent moon and bearer of flame. Nefertari listened without interrupting. When the stranger finished, she asked only one question. Why come now? He answered that the signs had grown stronger. Earth trembled in lands where it once lay still. Animals migrated in strange directions. The skies, once silent, had sent meteors falling in the dark. The balance between the realms, the living, the dead, and the divine, was thinning. And if the queen did not act, that balance could collapse. He left that evening, disappearing into the sands as quickly as he had come. The scroll he brought remained unopened on her table. That night, Nefertari stood on her balcony, overlooking the river. Lamps glowed across the water, and a warm breeze rose from the south. She remembered the image from the temple, the woman with the crown of stars, wrapped in flame. She felt no fear, only a deep knowing that her path was unfolding exactly as it must. The wind whispered across the Nile, and somewhere in the distance, thunder echoed without clouds. The shadow over Thebes. The days in Thebes grew heavy, The skies remain cloudless, yet the air pressed down like stone. People moved slower, animals stirred at odd hours, and the Nile ran unusually still, its surface smooth like polished glass. The city held its breath, as if something was coming, something it could not yet name. Inside the palace, Nefertari watched in silence. She had begun to sense the storm, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those around her. Meetings with advisors grew tenser. Courtiers questioned her long walks, her solitude, her increasing time spent in the temples. Some whispered she had grown too mystical, too quiet. Others feared her visions, though she had not spoken of them aloud. One evening, while reviewing petitions in her study, she discovered a scroll tucked between two official documents. It was unsigned, the handwriting unfamiliar. But the message was clear: there are those who believe Egypt should not be guided by stars. She read it twice, slowly, and then placed it into the fire. The flame flickered, bright and sudden. That night, lightning cracked the sky above Thebes for the first time in many months. No rain fell, only thunder, rolling over the desert like a voice too vast to understand. Soon after, word arrived that one of the border cities had gone silent. Messengers sent did not return. Soldiers dispatched to investigate found the gates open and the streets deserted. Not destroyed, simply empty, as if the people had vanished. Ramses ordered increased patrols. He urged Nefertari to stay within the palace walls, but she refused. Something deeper than politics was unfolding, and she felt the tremors in her bones. In the quiet of her garden, beneath a fig tree where she once meditated, she opened the scroll from the desert stranger at last. The script was ancient, unfamiliar, but her eyes followed its symbols as if they were already written in her mind. It spoke of balance and of fracture, of a queen whose soul was part flame, part river, one who would be tested not by enemies at the gate, but by those closest to her. In that moment, Nefertari knew. The shadow over Thebes was not cast from outside. It had roots within the court, perhaps even the palace itself. She stood slowly, the scroll still in her hands. A single word repeated in her mind like a heartbeat: prepare. And in the distance, the wind carried dust across the Nile, veiling the moon. Nefertari's choice. The palace no longer felt like stone and gold. It felt like silence, an unnatural quiet, heavy and watching. Nefertari moved through its halls with calm grace, but she could sense the shift. Eyes lingered too long, servants whispered less. Messages arrived late, or not at all. And still the river whispered warnings, only she seemed to hear. Her dreams had grown restless. Each night, she saw fire on water, stars falling like tears, and voices calling her name from beneath the earth. But one vision returned again and again. Two paths in the sand, one clear and easy, the other lost in shadow. And she stood between them, holding nothing but a flame cupped in her hands. She kept these dreams to herself. That morning, just after dawn, she received word that a scroll had been intercepted, one sealed with her emblem but never written by her. It had been sent to a distant governor, instructing him to withhold grain from the temples, a false order, a deliberate attempt to undermine her name. Only a handful of people had access to her seal. Later that same day, Ramses summoned her in private. He looked tired, his voice quiet. Reports had reached him from multiple cities. Rumors that Nefertari had turned from the gods of Egypt, that she was following unknown stars, trusting visions rather than law. He did not believe them, not fully. But the court was uneasy, and the pressure on him was growing. He asked her one question. Would she step back from the temples, for now, to calm the unrest? She looked into his eyes, the same eyes that once watched her on a temple balcony, long ago, when they were only two souls drawn together by fate. He still loved her, but he was afraid, not of her, but of what surrounded her. And in that moment, she understood her choice was no longer between what was safe and what was dangerous. It was between what was true and what was easy. That evening, as the sun fell beyond the edge of the Nile, Nefertari climbed alone to the highest terrace of the palace. Below her, Thebes stretched out in golden shadow, the river curling like a serpent of light. She breathed in deeply, the scent of myrrh, the coolness of dusk, the pulse of the wind. She thought of her mother's stories, her father's silence, the scrolls, the temples, the stranger in the cloak. She thought of the hidden symbols, the fading stars, and the crown of flame. And then quietly, she made her choice. She would not retreat. She would not soften truth to please fear. She would continue to listen, to the wind, to the river, to the sacred messages buried in sand and sky. If she was to be tested, let the test come. That night, she called a private meeting with her most trusted priestesses. In the hush of a hidden chamber, lit only by oil lamps, she began to share what she had seen, what she had read, and what she now believed must come. Some listened in silence. One wept. All stayed. And when she finished, she said only, "If I must stand alone, I will. But I believe Egypt is ready for something deeper than fear." Outside, lightning cracked again over Thebes. But this time, it felt not like a threat, but an answer. Eternity beneath the stars. Night returned to Thebes, not with shadows, but with stillness. The city seemed to pause beneath the sky, as if it too waited, not for an event, but for understanding. High above, the stars glittered more brightly than they had in weeks. The winds calmed, the Nile glowed in soft silver curves, whispering along the banks like memory. In the palace, a hush had fallen. The court still murmured, the guards still watched, but something in the air had shifted. Nefertari's choice had been made. She would not abandon the truth for comfort, nor silence her soul for safety. And yet, she was not defiant. She remained still, clear, present. The prophecies had never promised peace, only clarity. The final sign came quietly. A message arrived from the astronomer priests of Heliopolis. A rare celestial alignment would occur that very night. 5 stars and 2 planets would trace a perfect arc above the temple at Luxor, a pattern unseen in more than 1,000 years. The same configuration that appeared on the ancient scroll, etched into walls, lost beneath desert sands. Nefertari knew this was no coincidence. As the sky deepened, she made her way to the temple of Luxor. Not with soldiers or ceremony, but alone, in a white robe, with her veil lifted to the night air. The temple stood quiet, lit only by oil lamps placed along the columns. High above, the heavens began to move. Slowly, gently, the arc began to form. She walked through the stone halls, passing gods carved into walls, each one watching, or perhaps listening. At the center of the temple, beneath the open roof, she stood. She placed the scroll from Abu Simbel on the ground before her. She removed her sandals, she breathed in the cool air, and then she closed her eyes. No words were spoken. There was no chant, no ritual, only presence, only the heartbeat of the world. The stars aligned. Above her, the arc completed. In that moment, something ancient unfolded. Not in fire, but it in stillness. Not in vision, but in knowing. She felt it rise within her. The river, the desert, the memory of stone, the softness of wind. She felt every queen before her, every priestess, every whisper, passed from hand to hand across generations. And she felt herself, not as ruler, not as legend, but as woman, standing in the truth of who she was. When she opened her eyes, the temple was the same, but everything was different. She returned to the palace at dawn. The days that followed were quiet. The court did not rise against her. The whispers faded. Even those who doubted her began to pause, to watch, to feel. She did not claim victory. She did not speak of visions. She ruled with calm, with listening, with presence. And those who came near her felt something they could not name. A steadiness like the Nile itself. Years passed. Thebes changed. Egypt changed. But the memory of Nefertari remained. In time, a temple would be built for her, carved into stone, facing the sun. Her name would be written beside the gods. Not because she demanded it, but because her soul had become part of the land, the stars, the silence between winds. And some say, on certain nights, when the river is calm and the sky is clear, you can feel her, still walking barefoot through the gardens, still listening to the sky, still whispering to those who dare to follow their own truth. The end. Thank you for journeying through the story of Nefertari, the mysterious queen of Egypt.